Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, From Research to Policy in Youth Employment, Rigorous Evidence from Randomized Evaluations. My name is Nathaniel Goldberg. I'm the Director of Sector Programs at IPA, and I'll be hosting and moderating today's discussion. There'll be time for Q&A at the end of the session, so you can submit your questions at any time through the Q&A box, and we'll answer as many as we can. The webinar will also be recorded and available after the session. I'm pleased to welcome 5 guests to our panel today. We have Emily Beam, Assistant Professor, University of Vermont, Laura Chioda, Senior Economist at the World Bank, Paul Gertler, Professor of Economics at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, Patrick Primand, Senior Economist at the World Bank, and Herman Twali, Coordinator, Bureau de Coordination des Programmes d'Emploi in Côte d'Ivoire. Before we dive into the panel, I'll take a few minutes to explain what IPA does. IPA is a research and policy nonprofit that discovers and promotes effective solutions to global poverty problems. We bring together researchers and decision makers to design, rigorously evaluate, and refine these solutions and their applications, ensuring that the evidence created is used to improve the lives of the world's poor. Since our founding in 2002, we've worked with 600 leading academics to conduct 850 evaluations in 51 countries. We support these evaluations and the related evidence sharing through 22 country offices and a number of sector programs, including financial inclusion, SMEs, peace and recovery, social protection, education. Our strategy lays out 3 critical pillars to get evidence to be used. First, creating stronger evidence. So this is typically done through RCTs. The second is sharing evidence strategically, both globally, like we're doing today, and locally with decision makers and implementing organizations. And the third is equipping decision makers to use evidence. There we build long-term, long-lasting relationships with decision makers. Last year, as you probably heard, we were honored when 3 of our close collaborators, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael were awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, or whatever you call the Nobel Prize in Economics, for their pioneering work in developing this approach. Today's discussion is on youth employment, which has important implications for future economic growth, development, and stability. In today's presentations, Laura Chioda and Paul Gertler will highlight a leadership and entrepreneurship skill development program for secondary school students in Uganda and its impact on enrollment rates and graduate soft skills. Emily Beam will discuss the effect of a national employment bridging program in the Philippines on education outcomes, youth employability, and employment. Patrick Primand will show how a subsidized dual apprenticeship program leads to a net increase of apprenticeship positions for youth and firms while increasing youth earnings and productivity. And Herman Twali will provide insights on using evidence to inform policy in Côte d'Ivoire. The studies which will be presented today are part of a broader set of evaluations focused on youth employment at IPA, as you can see here. So look out for future sharing of evidence on these studies. And before we start, since it's timely, I'd like to put in a quick plug for IPA's new research hub devoted to COVID-19 responses. There we'll be sharing survey instruments, data, and projects to help researchers coordinate their approaches and to share rapidly what we're learning with decision makers. You can find the COVID research hub called Recover on IPA's website. Now let's begin. Each of the research teams will have 15 minutes to present findings, followed by comments from Herman, and we've reserved 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So as a reminder, please submit your questions at any time through the Q&A box. And Laura and Paul, and now you can take over.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank IPA for organizing this event. We found these webinars extremely useful to get feedback and disseminate up to the minute research. And they've been doing a great job, not only in supporting research, but in dissemination. Thanks to Nathan for the introduction and the IPA infomercial. So let me start now by discussing one of a set of projects which focuses on how can we change the secondary school experience in order to improve the lives of youth as they go forward. Much of this is focused on what types of non-traditional skills can we embed in the secondary school curriculum, and then see how that affects various dimensions of the lives of youth. In this one, we're working with a wonderful NGO called PEJEDEC, which started in Uganda and has expanded to Kenya and Rwanda and other East African countries to evaluate their program, which is really focused on building leaders. Leadership or leaders, the leadership skills that the literature talks about are really focused on soft skills. Individual leaders are people who can organize groups of people to diagnose problems, develop solutions, organize and motivate teams of people to buy into plans to address those issues, and actually motivate people to implement those plans and stay the course. And it requires not only interpersonal skills in terms of motivation and communication, and it requires intrapersonal skills, planning, and then staying disciplined to control one's emotions to manage these things. And PEJEDEC has put together a really wonderful curriculum to provide these skills. Okay, let me do this. Laser pointer, there we go. Okay, so we're going to focus on a leadership intervention. We're going to use a field experiment to evaluate it. And the leadership skills are embedded in secondary school curriculum. So we're going to be looking at Uganda, and during the last 2 years of secondary school, before the onset of economically and socially active roles, we look at this curriculum. We're going to follow these students for, at least today, for 4 years after they got the curriculum, and look at how it affects their outcomes in both economic and social outcomes. One of the keys to this is that late teens and individuals in their late teens and early 20s are in a key phase for brain development. And the parts of the brains that are developing are the ones that are responsible for executive function and the types of soft skills. Now, the main, and these really are the frontal cortex. And we've, the neurological literature has found a high degree of malleability in the frontal cortex amongst this age group. And this is akin to what motivated large interventions in early childhood development, that language recognition skills and other skills are developing very early in life. And so it led to massive investment in not only preschool, but early childhood interventions between age 1 and age 3. What we found is there's another phase of brain development where the brain is malleable, which are teenagers and early 20s. And so secondary school is really a good place to try and promote and teach these soft skills. And so we're going to be looking at, can leadership and soft skills be taught? Are those changes persistent? In other words, Do we see improvements in skills 4 years after the intervention? And then how do they shape lives? How does leadership manage self throughout the life cycle? And in particular, leadership is not just important for starting and running businesses. It's for community leadership. And it's also how you manage your lives. Do I develop a plan for my life? Do I stay the course and deliver that plan? Do I not engage in risky behaviors which might derail those plans? And so we're going to be looking today at the first phase of this, which is how do these skills affect investments in your own education? How do they affect employment and earnings? We'll look at how it affects choice of partners. So one of the key things in life is if you get a good partner, that helps enable the rest of your lives. If you get a bad partner, it can lead to intimate partner violence or derailing of your plans. And then things related to social norms and daily behavior. Okay. All right, so just to give you a preview, what are the takeaways? What we're going to find is it had large impacts on soft skills, both self-reported and task-based measures. It did not have really any effect on business knowledge or skills, traditional business skills. We also find that Educate led to a massive increase in post-secondary investment, especially amongst women, in terms of high school graduation, continuing on to university, and majoring in STEM. And because of that, the training has not yet translated into better labor market outcomes. So those people who would have gone into the labor market and presumably done well continued on to university. And about a third of our sample is still in university, and those are the ones who are likely to do well in the labor market. And we're going back in 8 years after to really look at these labor market outcomes. But the program not only generated larger investments in own human capital, it generated important social spillovers. So less risky behavior, less likely to have sex, the number of partners, delays in family formation in terms of starting to have children later, reduced number of children. They also found better partners who shared their preferences. It led to shifts in social norms, especially about the status of women, and reductions in intimate partner violence. Okay, so briefly, just to give you an idea of the study setup, we're working with Educate, whose mission is to endow youth with the skills to succeed in today's economy. They have large operations in Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya, and are really partners with secondary schools throughout the region. And we're looking at skill development in the last 2 years of secondary school, focused on social leadership, soft skills, personal initiative development, and basic elements of social entrepreneurship. Okay, so the intervention involves 3 components. A skills lab, which is essentially coursework, where they learn about leadership, self-efficacy, confidence, critical thinking, problem solving through games, group work, and public speaking. They have business clubs, which give them practical experience in starting and developing a social enterprise, and mentors to help them identify ideas and develop them into social enterprises and community workshops. The intervention is about 47 hours over 5 terms for the classroom part. Mentorship is 13 hours, and the business clubs meet weekly but don't have a endpoint. about 70 to 80% of the instruction time are on soft skills. Okay. It was a clustered RCT all over Uganda. I'm going to use the usual Jedi professor technique of proof by intimidation by asserting that the RCT was implemented well, and the results are come out of a well-designed field experiment. Okay, so let's look at some of the results, and let's start with skills. So we're going to see strong and meaningful impact on soft skills and personality. And so up here are the point estimates. Stars are the happy faces of statistical results. The more stars, the more statistical significance. And these are all measured in standard deviations. And the bars give us the treatment effects, and these are the point estimates. So we see large and significant reductions in stress, improvements in self-efficacy, grit, the two components of grit, both perseverance and passion, pro-sociality, so these kids report caring more about other people rather than just own monetary gain. And then a task-based measure on creativity, where essentially we ask them, what are all the uses of a rod, a stick or a rod of a certain length? And they had a minute to respond. And the more creative their responses, the higher the score. And there we found a 0.13 standard deviation improvement in creativity. We also find strong and meaningful improvements on the big five, that these are measures of personality traits which are used in many surveys throughout the year. Extroversion, agreeableness, openness in particular is one which is strongly associated with leadership. And then summaries of these two, plasticity and stability. Okay. Now, we also gave youth a task-based measure, which is, remember, this is coming off of survey data that was conducted 4 years after the training ended. So this is not immediately after the training is over, but 4 years later. So if these skills had temporary effects and the effects dissipated, we wouldn't see them 4 years later. All right, so this is a youth persuasion exercise where we gave them a scenario. Basically, the government has a program where they're giving out land, and can you take a minute and try and persuade the government to give you the land? We taped it, recorded it, and then had community leaders and business people grade the persuasion activities. And so they were more likely to give the person the land, more likely to want to do business with them, and more likely to hire them. So this is evidence that the training led to improved persuasion and communication. Okay. Then, while there was training on business skills, there's really no effect on business knowledge. How do you develop ideas, understanding budgets, profit and loss statements, deliberative dialogue, win-win situation. There is some, and that comes out of the negotiation discussion. So we find strong effects of education on soft skills and leadership, but little effect on business knowledge and business skills. Okay, so now let's shift to how did these, so the proximal outcomes of the EDUCATE intervention was about building skills. We have strong evidence in the first step in the results chain that we saw large increases in soft skills. How did these skills translate into investment in your own human capital? All right, so here we're looking at investment in school, And the way to read these things is the bar is the outcome for the treatment group, and the diamond is the outcome for the control group. And the difference between the bar and the diamond is the treatment effect, which is recorded above. So we find fairly large effects on completing high school, mostly driven by women. So gray is overall, light blue are women, dark blue are men. So we have an increased, especially amongst women, rates of secondary school completion. We have very large effects on continuing on to university, 8 percentage points, only for women, not for men. And then once you're in university, we find a very large effect, especially for women, on majoring in STEM or businesses. So not only are we getting higher educational attainment, we're getting high earning activities in terms of STEM or and business outcomes. We had no overall effects on labor market participation and earning. We think this is due to the fact that most people are still in university, and because of the treatment effects on education, when we go back at the 8-year follow-up, we should find, we expect to find labor market outcomes and increased earnings. All right, social spillovers. So these are non-human capital, non-labor market outcomes, but we find fewer sexual partners since high school, fewer number of partners overall, so less risky behavior. We find reductions in pregnancy and reductions in the number of children. We find dramatically changed gender norms. So men seem to recognize women's agency much more and acknowledge their roles outside the home. Women are more likely to embrace and support roles as equals in both households and labor market decisions. So for example, the norm, the male decides whether the female partner can work. Well, that dropped for both males and females. The female can ask to use a condom. That increased for both males and females and so forth. Okay. And then in terms of intimate partner violence, we saw improvements both in norms and reduction in the incidence of violence. So the social acceptability of violence goes down by 0.14 standard deviations, and the incidence of the threat of physical violence reported by women falls by 0.06 standard deviations. Okay, so now let's look inside couples' decision makings. So first thing to note is that Educate graduates are more selective in their relationships. I'm going to skip this one. And what we find is that women are getting younger partners, that women are getting partners that have higher earnings potentials, and men are getting partners that have higher social status. Okay. And then this one is looking at couples' decision makings and how these skills change things. So we ask a bunch of questions about decisions that most couples have to make. Should women work or not? Fertility decisions, when to have a child, and condom use during sex. We aggregated these results and looked at a series of important outcomes. So the first thing is in these decisions, we wanted to know, are they living with partners that share common views of the world, that have the same values? And so what's going on is that for women in particular, they have partners where their initial agreement, they initially just have common views of work, fertility and condom use. And that for the control group, that's about 45%, and then for the treatment group, it's 13 percentage points higher. So that's a very large effect. So women are finding partners who have shared values with them. Second, then we talk about the negotiation decision and the final outcome, and we see that the respondent agrees with the final decision. And in both cases, both men and women are more likely to agree with the final decision. And to note that for women in particular, agreement with the final decision is about the same as the agreement with the initial decision. That suggests most of it comes from partner choice and less of it from improved bargaining once you're in the relationship. Okay, so conclusions. Educate training seemed to succeed in improving skills associated with leadership, reducing stress, self-actualization, creativity, grit, passion, social attitudes, the big five, communications, and persuasion skills. It affected investments in human capital, in particular education, especially for females. More likely to finish high school, more likely to go on to college, and major in business and STEM. One thing that we have but aren't presenting, it turns out a lot of these treatment effects are masking differences in personality characteristics. So who are the types of men and women who are more likely to go on to college and major in STEMs? Well, it tends to be people who at baseline were high IQ, but less secure. And so this helps women who, for personality reasons, haven't exploited or taken advantage of their innate cognitive skills. We find less work and income in the short run, but we expect this to be reversed in the future as the treatment group comes out of college. We find long-term social spillovers, less risky sex, delayed fertility, improvement in gender norms, and finding partners who have shared preferences to reduce disagreement within the household. And one of the things we think this study does methodologically, it highlights the importance of not doing just a one-year follow-up, but really these results emerged 4 years later, and now we're doing an 8-year follow-up next year. So I'll end there and thank the group for this opportunity to present.
Thanks very much, Paul. Over to Emily on employment bridging in the Philippines. And Emily, we can't hear you.
I definitely know how to unmute a microphone. So thanks, everyone. So what I'm going to share with you today is work from an impact evaluation of a summer employment program implemented by the Philippine government targeting low-income youth, primarily in-school youth in both high school and college. This is something that's administered by the Department of Labor, funded by 3IE and DFAT. And so where we're coming from going into this study was we were thinking about the trade-offs between employment and schooling, right? On the one hand, we know it's been well established there are high returns to completing secondary school, to going on and completing college. At the same time, particularly for individuals from low-income families, financial constraints are real and important, both in terms of covering tuition, in terms of paying for other out-of-pocket expenses, and also just opportunity costs of not working, but instead attending education. In our context in the Philippines, very few students are working while enrolled in school, and in our study, the demand for work among students is very high. Similarly, from other work I've done, we know that employers in the Philippines highly value having any work experience at all, even for entry-level jobs. And most active labor market programs, though, are focusing on students who are, or not students, sorry, on youth who are out of school and trying to help link them to education, to employment programs. And so what's unique about this program is that we're thinking of it really as a bridging program. So students are in school, they're continuing to study, and the government's hoping to provide them with a work opportunity that might lead to better labor market outcomes and also help them stay in school. So the program we studied is the Special Program for Employment of Students, or SPES, which was established in 1992. So this is a mature program that's been implemented for more than 25 years at this point. And their goal is to help target these poor but deserving youth with the idea that they will earn money through work over the summer and during school breaks in order to continue their education. What the Department of Labor and Employment provides is a 40% wage subsidy to employers who hire students for 20 to 52 working days. These usually take place during summer vacation. And while there are allowances for students who are out of school but are intending to return, these are students who are currently in school. Although this is a national program implemented in nearly every municipality across the country, it's the local offices that are actually responsible for the implementation, doing the screening, the matching, which is primarily placing students into working in municipal city offices. So it's those city offices that are shouldering the other 60%. And that's in large part because for mayors, this is something very attractive to them. It's a way of showing that they can support the employment opportunities of youth in their community, which is something that they are particularly keen on when they're thinking about their election prospects. So this is a program, like I said, it's implemented nationally, established in 1992, and it's a program that's also grown quite substantially in terms of its budget and then consequently its enrollment over the past 10 years. And so in 2009, where you see that graph kind of shift and shoot up, both in terms of the annual budget and also annual beneficiaries, there was a law change right in here that said that there was a mandated 20% budgetary increase every year. And so that has played out, increasing the program's budget. And as a result, we've seen big increases in enrollment. And today it serves more than 250,000 students every year. And so when it's in effect, we're thinking of actually about 3% of youth that are employed are actually working in this program during those summer breaks. So the population that are being targeted here are by law, ages 15 to 25, in-school youth primarily, and from low-income families. But local governments are able to select sort of who they want based on how they advertise and how they recruit. In practice, a lot of times this is a sort of a first come, first serve type of process, though often mayors will actually provide sort of short lists of people they'd like to target, usually with an eye towards re-election campaigns. What we'll see here is when we're talking about the students, we're talking about students who are either 15 and 16 and in high school. And at the time of this study, in the Philippines, grade 10 was when you completed high school and then went on to post-secondary education if you wanted to, or enter the workforce. And so these are sort of the last 2 years of secondary school, or students in the first 2 years of post-secondary education. And in our study, it's primarily college. There are some students who are enrolled in technical vocational programs, but they made up a very small share, about 2% of our study sample. And so the question that we're asking with this study is whether this type of summer work experience, similar to many summer work programs you see in the United States, particularly in New York and Boston, but also across lots of major cities, does this affect both employment opportunities and education for low-income youth? We do this with a randomized oversubscription design across 3 regions. What I mean by that is we look at municipalities where there are more applicants than there are jobs. And so when that is the case, we randomize who gets those jobs. And we measure the effects 8 to 12 months after the program starts. We're going to focus on employment, skills, labor market perceptions, and job search. And the reason we're doing this is because we're thinking about sort of what is it about this experience that could affect employment outcomes, right? You could imagine that this work experience might help youth build skills, either general work skills or skills that are specific to a firm, right? You understand how this office works and the particular types of tasks that you would need to do. It may also provide an opportunity for employers to screen workers. It's a lot cheaper to hire someone when you only have to pay 60% of their salary, and then you can try them out. It may affect search effort. Once people are exposed to the formal labor market, they may be more motivated to look for work, or they may search differently because they've built better connections. Or it may signal productivity, right? That you've completed this summer opportunity has demonstrated that you are someone who is able to stick with it, able to arrive at work on time, et cetera. And we're also going to look at impacts on enrollment and grades, because that is one of the founding principles of the program as it was designed, that by earning money, this will help students stay in school, similar to work-study type programs. On the other hand, you might worry that if there are employment effects, this might actually lead to a reduction in enrollment. If students realize that there actually are good labor market opportunities out there, there might be an increase in employment that may come at the expense of their education. So in terms of our research design, like I said, we focus in 3 regions. The National Capital Region, which is essentially Metro Manila, right? So highly urbanized. Region 3 just to the north, still quite urban, and then Region 11 in the south, which has a mix of both urban and rural areas. We conducted the study in 22 municipalities where they had oversubscription, and we had a baseline sample of about 4,000 students. Just to talk through the actual research design, I want to highlight here, we're working with new eligible applicants. About 15% of applicants were returning to the program. These were high priority applicants, and so they weren't randomized, but again, they were a large share. We split people into 2 groups. One group received, I kind of cut those off. One group received the invitation to enroll in the program, and one received no invitation to enroll in the program. Though, of course, we're not going to see perfect compliance. Some people who were not invited still showed up anyways, and of course, even if you invite someone to enroll in the program, other things might come up and they might not. But the decision to receive that intervention is completely random, and so we're able to compare those 2 groups in terms of their education outcomes, their employment outcomes, and their employability outcomes, which is what we looked at. We collected our baseline data in early 2016. The program was implemented during the summer break of 2016, just before the 16-17 academic school year. And we collected endline data right at the end of the school year, though a few activities extended back into the summer break. So in terms of our results, what do we find? First off, in terms of the nature of the program, so this is one thing that we thought was important to quantify systematically. It's a program that spans 20 to 52 days, but in practice, it's a 20-day program. And this is largely because our qualitative work found that for mayors, if you have a fixed budget and you're trying to make your program available for as many students as possible, you choose the minimum program duration for the maximum number of students, and that's what we saw. Most students were doing office work, surveying, updating records, organizing documents. Some of the tasks you'll see around here, kind of cleaning, maintaining cleanliness of the office, these I would really think of as kind of make work tasks. Some students said their job was literally to move the chairs around. This happened in a lot of offices where maybe 30, 40 students would come into a small office and there's no way they could actually find that much meaningful work. For private sector employers, tasks tended to be a little bit more skill-based, providing customer service, sales, interacting one-on-one, but that was a relatively small share of the number of tasks that students did. The other thing we learned about the program was that in principle, if we were thinking about an education trajectory, right, you want to receive money in order to pay for your schooling fees and offset the cost of you not working. That requires you to be paid on time. One thing we observed was that there were quite a lot of payment delays. This was something that the government was aware of and working actively to address, but was still a logistical challenge. It wasn't bad from the side of employers. The program hoped that everyone would be paid within a month. And that was largely true for the 60% that employers paid, but for the Department of Labor, only about less than a third were actually able to be paid on time, their 40% subsidy. And for about half, it took 3 months or more. And there was a decent share who still had not received their 40% subsidy at the time that we talked to them, which made it a bit challenging for both the students and also was frustrating for the offices because they wanted to make sure students were connected with their funds. So in terms of employment, what we saw was that, in some ways, we're looking at things in the short run. Students aren't finishing school at this point. The school year isn't over. Nobody's graduated. And if people have questions about it, we can talk about why this was graduation isn't an outcome that we were going to be looking at, because at this point in time, the Philippine government added 2 additional years of schooling. And so actually nobody graduated from grade 10, they just proceeded to grade 11. So despite all this, we do see increases, substantial increases in the likelihood of people reporting they're currently employed, either in the private sector or public sector or with a nonprofit organization. And this was a big increase, largely because the base is relatively low. So we see about a 4.2 percentage point effect. From a technical perspective, I'm reporting here instrumenting for enrollment. So these are local average treatment effects. If you want to think about just the impact of being assigned to the program, then you should just kind of have the effects, because that's about what our first stage is. We see that this program, the increase in employment, is focused entirely on post-secondary students, which made sense to us. Those are the students who have other private sector and employment options because they're slightly older, have more skills. One thing that was very important is we see that this increase in employment does not come at the expense of school enrollment. So we were worried if people are working more, maybe they're also leaving school, and that did not seem to be the case. They seem to be pairing work with enrollment. And we didn't see any differences by gender. We see positive increases for both men and women in the sample. In terms of why we're seeing this, we thought, well, is it because of skills? Is it because of improved different changes in job search? So what might be happening here? And we see that even though they're engaging in this range of job tasks that I talked about, we don't see any change in skills on the measures that we have, right? Which are not perfect, but we don't see any change in experience with office-related work tasks. We don't see any change in non-cognitive skills measured through a series of life skills measures. We don't see changes in student self-esteem. We don't see changes in job search activity. We don't see changes in reservation wages. We do see students being more confident about their work prospects, which makes sense because they have greater employment opportunities. So that's somewhat predictable. We're not seeing action on these dimensions particularly. In terms of education, we don't see any change in enrollment. Part of this is that in the control group, the enrollment rate is very high, right? Essentially, in order to enroll in this program, we need to be either enrolled in school or planning to return. In effect, most students who applied to the program were already enrolled in school, partially because that's how the local governments tended to prioritize students. They wanted those who could, when they thought about the poor but deserving, they thought of deserving as already in school. And so as a result, because of this program targeting, there isn't huge margin to try to keep students in school. We do see marginally statistically significant increases for men and high school students. They're the ones at higher risk of dropping out of school. But again, the magnitudes aren't that high just because the baselines are already quite high. When people don't enroll, it is often because of financial problems, suggesting that there is a gap between having the resources you need to continue on in your education that's not being fully filled. It just doesn't seem that SPES is successful in doing that in a significant way. So in terms of summarizing our findings, we find that the short-term work experience can raise employment, even in the median run, not at the expense of education. We find that this is consistent with signaling that applicant quality, like I have completed this job successfully, because we see limited opportunities for new skills. We don't see changes in employability measures. We also don't see people staying with the same employers. Most are finding new jobs. So we don't even think it's a firm-specific skill. We don't see any change in impact. And we highlighted, for us, this really highlighted how important it was to reach marginal students for cost-effective programming, right? So even if you were able to get 100% enrollment with this particular population, that program would still cost about $1,300 per dropout avoided, which is just not practical. Of course, for this program, employment and education, while those might be the aims of the program, aren't the only benefit, right? Students are still receiving payment for their work. That may be very important for helping to support education of other family members, for contributing to their family expenditures. There may be other benefits. We're just thinking in terms of these two incomes, but on those dimensions, this is not necessarily the most effective program. I wanted to wrap up in my last minute with just thinking about some policy-specific findings. One thing that was interesting about this study is that because we're working really closely with the government, we wanted to make sure that this was actionable and useful for them. So we coupled our quantitative study with also a process evaluation. And so a few takeaways we had here was that the program may be more effective as a work program than an education program, but like I said, the costs are very high. However, we do see that employers do value this work experience, even in the absence of skill acquisition. So that's something useful to think about as they go forward. And we talked with the Department of Labor about trying to help work experience provide meaningful skills, because that's not what's happening in this program. And it may be the case that increasing the minimum number of working days is actually quite important. Since the study, they've increased the maximum number, but that actually hasn't done anything if everyone's bunched on the lower end. And that targeting may be really important here. We did our best to estimate what's likely if people are in households that live below the poverty line. And in practice, it's not a very large share. Only about 4% were likely to be below the poverty line, but it is the students from poor families who are benefiting most from the program in terms of educational benefits. This is challenging because of political considerations, but it may be quite important. And finally, both the study and the program highlighted the importance of communication between the regional and local offices. This was a challenge to implement the study, but also a challenge for the actual implementation of the program, because the aims at the national and regional level don't necessarily align with the goals and incentives at the local level. So I'm going to wrap up here, but we can always talk more at the discussion section. So thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Now we have Patrick Perman on apprenticeships in Côte d'Ivoire.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today to present results from an impact evaluation of an apprenticeship program in Côte d'Ivoire. This is part of a large collaboration with the government of Côte d'Ivoire and the Office Coordinating Employment Program that is managed by Herman Twali, who is also on the panel. There are two key features of the employment challenge in low-income countries and in Africa in particular. One is that there's relatively little unemployment, in the sense of that most people, and most young people in particular, are often working one way and another in low productivity occupations. And so there's a big challenge to increase productivity and earnings for all the individuals that are working in these low productivity occupations, including in the informal sector. One of the other challenges is that there is a large population of low-skilled individuals that have dropped out of the education system relatively early, being in primary or secondary school, and that represent a large part of the population also in the informal sector. So how do we think about improving skills and earnings for this low-skilled population? One thing that is very striking in Africa is that if you look at the type of training that individuals are able to get, you see that the prevalence of traditional apprenticeships is much higher than the prevalence or the participation in formal technical and vocational training. So there may be up to 4 times more young people that have gone through traditional apprenticeships compared to young people that have gone through formal technical and vocational training. So, and this type of training is particularly relevant for young people that end up working in the informal sector or low-skilled individuals. Now, this type of prevalent traditional apprenticeships are most of the cases often private arrangements between individuals or their relatives and firm owners or master craftsmen in small firms. So these are private arrangements that have been around for decades without any state intervention. But despite the large number of young people in these apprenticeships, there are still questions about this traditional apprenticeship model. So one question is accessibility. They may be young people that either don't have the networks or don't have the financial means to participate in these kind of traditional apprenticeships. On the other hand, there can also be major constraints in terms of training quality. It is not clear that those traditional apprenticeships that involve on-the-job training in small informal firms provide the necessary skills to be productive on the labor market. So what we'll do today is show you results from a program that tries both to improve access to apprenticeships and to improve the quality of apprenticeship training. And this program is a program that was put in place in Côte d'Ivoire as part of a national youth employment and skills development project. And this program promoted subsidized dual apprenticeships. So the program had 2 key components. The first one is that young people selected for this program signed a formal apprenticeship contract and were eligible for a subsidy or a stipend of about $60 a month, which in Côte d'Ivoire is about half the minimum wage. That subsidy and that contract for formal apprenticeships lasted for between 12 and 24 months, depending on the trades. The second main component of this program is that young apprentices receive dual training with oversight from the National Training Agency. They participated in on-the-job training in small firms. So there they were really trained on the job by firm owners or experienced workers that would just teach them the tools of the trade in the sector that they were participating in. This was accompanied by some monitoring of skill acquisition by apprenticeship counselor. But in addition to that, what made this training dual is that apprentices also participated in theoretical training delivered by training centers, which were a mix of private and public centers. And that was based on a curriculum that was tailored to low-skill individuals. So the training curriculums that this vocational center usually delivered were mostly for students that had completed secondary school or above. They had to completely redesign this curriculum for low-skill individuals that may have only less than primary or only primary education at best. So again, the main feature is that the training was dual, combining on-the-job and theoretical training. That led to the possibility of receiving a certification that was awarded jointly by firms, by the apprenticeship and training agency, as well as a private sector experts. The average cost of the program was about $2,000 per apprentices. So when the government set up this program, we sat down together and we identified critical questions for policy decision around these programs. And in this presentation, I will highlight two questions. So one is, to what extent this apprenticeship program impacts youth? To what extent does this allow them to acquire skills, gain employment, and increase their earnings? And then secondly, what is the impact of this type of program on firms that are hosting apprentices? And there, one of the key concern or question is, to what extent, once the government subsidizes the worker to take a formal apprenticeship position in a firm, to what extent are we really creating a new apprenticeship position, or to what extent are we purely substituting a traditional apprentice by a formal apprentice? So I will, so in order to answer this question, we set up a double-sided experiment where, without going into details, the process was that firms were invited to open apprenticeship positions in selected trades. Based on those apprenticeship positions open, youth were interested to apply for apprenticeship positions. They would apply to apprenticeship position not in a specific firms, but in a trade in general. So it could be mechanics, carpentry, or any other trades. And then once we had collected both the number of open apprenticeship positions and the number of applications from youth, about half the firms and half the youth were randomly selected to participate in the program. So you see here in the graph, so we had about 730 firms that expressed interest for the program, of which 361 were selected to participate and 370 were assigned to a control group. We can use that side of the experiment to measure impacts at the firm level. On the other side, we had about 1,800 youth that applied to participate in the program. About half were selected to participate, and the other half was assigned to the control group. So we can measure differences between participating youth and control group to measure impacts on youth of this subsidized dual apprenticeship program. Now, we collected data at 2 points in time. We first collected a round of data in the short term, about 20 months after the start of the program. Think of this as data collected when the program was still ongoing. And then we collected another round of data about 4 years after the start of the program, or 2 years after the end of the program. Think of this as providing medium-term impact of this intervention on youth, again, 2 years after they have exited those apprenticeships. So I will discuss the two sets of results. So one, to what extent has this program expanded access to apprenticeship in the short term? And two, what is the impact of these subsidized apprenticeships on youth employment and earnings in the medium term? So in the short term, one of the key questions is to what extent has this program really increased the number of youth that are in apprenticeships, and to what extent has this really increased the number of apprenticeship positions in firms? So let me first show you the results on youth participation in apprenticeship. I will show you graphs where you have a blue bar that is the control group, a green bar that is the treatment group, and then the black bars will show you the impact on the indicators of interest. What we can see here is that the subsidized dual apprenticeship program leads to a very strong entry of youth in informal apprenticeships. These are, it's kind of a measure of take-up showing the share of youth that effectively enter this formal apprenticeship program. So this increases the share of youth in formal apprenticeship by 70 percentage points. Now, one key question is to what extent are these young people that are now entering these formal apprenticeships actually coming out of the traditional apprenticeship they would have obtained in the private market in absence of the intervention? And what we show is that there is a small decrease, small negative impact on the share of youth in traditional apprenticeship, but it's still much smaller than the increase in participation in formal apprenticeship. So what this means is that the program did succeed in increasing the share of youth, of young people in apprenticeship by a net effect of about 53 percentage points. We can do the exact same exercise at the firm level. So again, here the key question is to what extent does the placement of formal apprentices and subsidized apprentices into firms, to what extent does that actually create new apprenticeship position, or is it just reallocating existing position to subsidized youth? So what we see here is that we see a fairly large impact on the number of formal apprentices in firms that increases by about 1.4 apprentices per firm. We do see that firms hire a little less for informal or traditional apprentices by about 0.3. So there is a substitution effect. Firms do replace to some extent traditional apprentices by formal apprentices. However, this substitution effect is very small. It's only in terms of magnitude that in the magnitude for one subsidized apprentice place, only 0.23 informal apprentices are displaced. So the net effect is that the program is able to increase the net number of apprenticeship position in firm by about 1.1 apprentice per firm. So if we put together these two sides of the experiments, the effect on youth entry into apprenticeship and the effect on the number of apprenticeship position at the firm level, we can put a number on the net number of positions that are actually created. And the key number here is that we find that the program creates a net number of apprenticeship positions that is equal to between 74 and 77% of the number of formal apprentices that are placed. So in other words, if you have a subsidized apprenticeship program like this one, you place 1,000 young people in firms, your net impact on apprenticeship position is about 750. Now, the other important element in terms of short-term impact is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, in this kind of context like Côte d'Ivoire, there are relatively few individuals that are sitting idle and unemployed. Most people work in one occupation or another, even if in many cases it will be in informal occupations with relatively low earnings and productivity. So if I'm looking at the employment impact of this intervention in the short term, what you see here on the left of the graph is that the number of young people that are employed is in the control group is actually quite high. And you see that here I'm showing you earnings by total labor earnings. You see that youth in the control group have positive and relatively substantial labor earnings of about, in this case, about $100 a month. So what you see is that the labor earnings or the earnings of young people that are in the program is not statistically higher or lower than the earnings in the control group. So in the short term, there is no impact on earnings from this intervention. In fact, participants have to forego earnings in wage employment and self-employment in order to be able to participate in apprenticeship. So you can think of those as foregone labor earnings. Young people have to forego earnings in these other types of occupations in order to participate in the apprenticeship program. The earnings and the wages they get as apprentices are relatively low. So you see a positive impact on earnings from apprenticeship, but this positive impact on earning from apprenticeship is not sufficient to offset foregone earnings from wage employment and self-employment. It's only when you account for the wage subsidy, which is the last piece here, that the loss of labor earnings that apprentices incur is actually offset. So another way to look at this is that there are fairly strong opportunity costs for young people to participate in apprenticeship. And in our context, most likely the wage subsidy and the stipend was key to ensure that young people could make these investments in human capital. So let me turn to the impact on youth in the medium term. So now let's move 4 years after the launch of this experiment and 2 years after the end of the program. The headline results we find here is that we find a fairly substantial and statistically significant impact on young people's earnings. You see here on the left of the chart that total earnings in the control group is at about 60,000 CFA francs, which is about $120. And what you see is that the earnings in the treatment group that participated in the program is substantially higher. The effect is of about 15%, or 10,000 CFA francs a month, which is about $20 a month. So again, 2 years, close to 2 years after the end of the program. When you look at mechanisms, or from where those increases in earnings come from, we don't see impacts on earnings from wage employment. We see impacts coming from earnings from self-employment. So these are apprentices that have transitioned to working as self-employed and that have higher earnings and productivity in these self-employed occupations. We also see an increase in earnings from apprenticeships, which is interesting because these are not apprenticeships sponsored by the program anymore. These are young people that were apprentices in firms that have been retained by firms as apprentices and are now kind of increasing their earnings in those type of occupations. So the net effect here is an increase in earnings that is quite substantial and significant 2 years after the end of the program. When we look at where this impact on earning comes from, we don't see big changes in the type of occupation that young people are engaged in, but we see changes in productivity in the occupations in which young people work. So specifically, we have a series of measures of skills. And what I'm showing you here is to what extent young people are undertaking more complex tasks in their primary occupation. So for each young person, we ask them, what are the type of tasks that they do at work? And we classify those different types of tasks. And we're able to observe that young people that participated in the program are more likely to do a broader mix of tasks and a mix of tasks that includes more complex tasks. So we show you here different indices, an index showing the intensity of routine tasks, the intensity of non-routine analytical tasks. So this can, using plans, taking measurements, or tasks that require a high level of technicity, and then non-routine interpersonal tasks that requires interactions either with clients or customers or other workers in the firms. And what you see is that apprentices that graduate, or young people that graduating from this apprenticeship program are more likely to do a mix of all of those tasks. So more routine tasks, but also especially more non-routine analytical tasks of higher technicity, as well as more non-routine interpersonal tasks. When we aggregate all of those, we see an overall decrease in the routine task intensity of those tasks. So again, this is a way of showing that apprentices or young people through this apprenticeship program acquired skills that allow them to perform more complex tasks, and that likely explain the effect we see on earnings through increased productivity from from young people in the different occupations and different types of jobs that they hold. So let me conclude by highlighting what we have learned here. So we have shown that this subsidized dual apprenticeship program was successful in increasing incentive for youth to invest in their human capital through apprenticeship, in a way that is beneficial for them over the medium term. We find that earnings for youth that participated in the program are higher by 15% compared to a control group of comparable youth at baseline. And we see that these effects are mostly coming from higher productivity driven by higher skill and the ability to perform more complex tasks at work. We also saw that in the short term, participating in this apprenticeship program has large opportunity cost for youth. So even though the long-term benefits seem to be very encouraging here, there is a short-term cost for youth to participate in this kind of program because of the foregone earnings that they imply. And so most likely the wage subsidy here was important to allow young people to invest in their human capital through apprenticeships. And lastly, one of the important results is that the program truly was able to expand or increase the net number of apprenticeship positions in the firms that are in the sample. So it's not only reshuffling workers within firms, but it's truly expanding the number of positions that are available in firms in the short term. So we are working on a range of additional follow-up, both in Côte d'Ivoire and in other countries, to try to understand the long-term impact of these kind of schemes, to better understand the different elements of these programs that make them effective, whether it's the subsidy, the dual training, the certification schemes. And then lastly, an alternative approach is not so much to try to place apprentices into firms, but to work on apprentices that are already in traditional apprenticeships through informal arrangements and try to see whether it's possible to improve the quality of the training that they do. And so there is a few ongoing experiments and programs in West Africa that try to address that question. So with that, I'll leave it at that and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Now we'll turn it over to Herman for some comments.
Hello.
Go ahead, Herman, when you're ready.
Okay. Thank you, Nathaniel. So thank you very much for everybody. So I'm Herman Twali, the coordinator of the Youth Employment Program office in Ivory Coast. So our office in charge to manage the donator fund dedicated to youth employment project. So currently we have three projects active, two with employment and one on higher education. So my opinion of the subject will be in 3 levels. The first one is concern our office. What about we do with the study, for example? After the apprenticeship study was completed, we made some correction to the program itself based on its finding. One of these was strengthening the skills of master apprentices. Based on the study, in agreement with the World Bank and the government, we undertook a major apprenticeship reform in 2016 based on the new national regulatory framework for apprenticeship. A draft law on apprenticeship and implementing legislation have been drawn up, but the government wished to carry out a pilot phase on the basis of the degrees is issued in February 2019. This pilot phase will make it possible to make apprenticeship a real mode of vocational training based on 4 vocational training centers, which are currently being strengthened for equipment, infrastructure, and team training. This reform introduced 2 types of apprenticeship by awarding a 3-year diploma, the certificate of professional competence, and short training courses with professional qualification certificates. The innovative feature on this reform is that apprentices have a status as salaried employees during the training for 3 years and therefore receive a salary that corresponds to a percentage of the legal minimum wage. The delay of drafting, implementing legislation, rules and regulation, as well as the delay in the creating of the apprenticeship project have prevented the apprenticeship to be reformed accordingly. Based on this reform, the first apprentices should have started in April, yet the event of the COVID-19 pandemic has derailed all plans. I can say that generally I can give you some lessons learned about the implementation of youth employment program in Ivory Coast. The establishment of a transparent selection process have helped to build trust with young people and as well as with the company, which is conducive to youth employment. According to satisfaction surveys from young people and companies, more than 19% consider the process transparent. The involvement of the private sector in the whole process gave an added impetus to the implementation of the project activities. In terms of integration, it promoted positive results. In particular, post-program service show an average of 17 and 80% employment integration rate. However, there is a lack of training program specifically adapted to the needs of people with low literacy skills. It's necessary to create this program because all our salary employed programs require a minimum level of literacy. But I can say that we have the entrepreneurship program. We do some image training model for not literate young people. The second level concerns the government, because I talk about our office, now I will talk about the government. We are capitalizing on what we are doing with the OVER program, but the harmonization of procedure based on good practice and lesson learned. For example, I talk about the transparency process. This transparency process, recruitment and selection process, as well as the amount of the premium have been harmonized with the program which has been improved with overfunding. We also strengthen the skills of master apprentices. 1,744 master apprentices have been trained in various trades: metal construction, automotive, mechanic, solar energy, etc. Another point is that young apprentices trained can now have a professional trade card issued by the National Chamber of Trade. We have just started a study for the implementation of a policy of valuing the acquired experience, which will be very beneficial for the master apprentices and later for the apprentices. The recommendation from the impact assessment will offer new direction for the future employment program, currently in the planning process. One of the recommendations of the study on apprenticeship is to integrate young people already in traditional apprenticeship program into firms. This option is being considered in the new project currently being prepared. For this particular apprenticeship, we can say that a long-term supplementary service is being considered in order to access the sustainability for the professional integration of young people in these firms. The third level concerns the monitoring and evaluation of youth employment program. I can say that it's necessary to initiate continuous exchange through the setting up of a think tank, for example, with government, researchers, and development partners that will work to provide more practical proposal, which a mechanic for medium and long-term monitoring and evaluation program. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much. Now I'd like to invite the panelists to go back into video mode, which I will do myself. And we've got a lot of good questions, so we probably won't have time to get to them all, but I will do my best. First question, which is kind of open for everybody, is maybe if you could share something about what the partners that you've worked with have done with the results. There are kind of a lot of nuances in what we're seeing, and so maybe not, you know, an easy, clear interpretation of how to move forward. And I'm wondering what the folks that you've worked with have decided to do. I don't know, Emily, would you be able to start with that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. So in our case, from the perspective of our work with the Department of Labor and Employment in the Philippines, we were a little bit nervous about sharing our results because they were certainly not what they were looking for, sorry, I should say what they were hoping for. And certainly when we talked to the secretary, I think what his initial quote was, "We need to rethink this program," which was really hard, like encouraging that they understood where we were coming from, and we had discussions about the limitations and things like that. Since that point in time, which would have been in early 2018, the process of making modifications to the program has been quite slow because all of it's basically enacted in law. It's not something where you can tweak it easily. But there has been increased focus on skill building and also on private sector participation, because that is an area where there seems to be sort of more promise than what you can do in some of these municipal office settings. They've also added to their own monitoring and evaluation framework a new outcome indicator to think about college graduation and TVET completion, which has been encouraging. And I know there's been a lot of interest from them about also trying to improve their monitoring and evaluation systems, but I think that's something that's still ongoing at this point.
Nathaniel, do you want me to come in
Yes,
and
please.
talk about Educate? So Paul mentioned earlier, the Educate are a wonderful NGO. They are wonderful for many reasons, not only for what they do on the ground and our partnership, but very much for their openness and willingness to kind of learn through these results, discuss these results with us, and then take it and kind of even modify the curriculum. We have been having several conversations. Again, they were involved throughout the study, and we had discussed the results with them at length. And one thing that clearly expressed interest was the willingness to, for instance, improve the R-skill curriculum and see whether they could improve some of the outcome along that dimension. We also, I think Paul and I also have another skill development program from youth. They're willing to learn from it. So there is a very much a rapid feedback from the generation of our results to how they are willing and eager to then incorporate them in their curriculum revision. And one also the advantage of Educated, they have a strong partnership with several countries, whether in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Kenya, and they're actually close, if you want, the policy dialogue where our results get immediately kind of exposed to the government and get kind of discussed in that framework. So there is very much use and dissemination that is coming from our partner on the ground. That again, is one of the many other reasons why they're wonderful.
Okay, great. And then for Patrick, I have a question for you, and I don't know if you want to add to that at the same time. A clarification question on the control group, whether it was all youth or it was specifically those who were in informal apprenticeships, and then also whether informal apprentices in Cote d'Ivoire typically get paid, or in some cases might they actually pay the master for the learning that they're getting.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So the traditional apprenticeship model in most of West Africa is one where young people make deal with firm owners to go learn on the job in those firms. So these are purely kind of informal agreements, and they mostly, this type of training mostly involved on-the-job training in these small informal firms. Very often, the young people or their parents have to pay the firm owner in order to get into the training. And very often they also have to pay a regular fee during the training, and they even have to pay sometimes a fee to exit the training. So there is often a direct cost, it is true. Though we see that in the context of our study, we see that the main cost of participating in apprenticeship is not so much the cost that the fees that you pay to the master craftsman. It's really the opportunity cost of not being able to get other jobs for a long period of time when you are in these relatively low paid apprenticeships. In the context of our study, we ask young people to apply to the apprenticeship program, and then we randomly allocated some of them to receive formal apprenticeships and others not to receive those formal apprenticeships. The control group was then free to operate on the labor market. Some of them ended up going into apprenticeships, traditional apprenticeships, and others ended up getting other types of jobs. So our control group includes youth that were interested in apprenticeships, and we study the way their employment outcomes evolve over time compared to those that participate in the subsidized apprenticeship program. Thank you.
Okay, and then a follow-up related question just to kind of help clarify for people, the concept of a dual apprenticeship is that you're working with apprentices and firms at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, so the traditional apprenticeship is purely on-the-job training. The dual apprenticeship includes, in addition to that, the opportunity to go and learn general skills in vocational training centers. So the apprentice split time between the firms and the vocational training centers and is able to get a formal certification coming out of this program. Compared to the traditional apprenticeship that's only working on the farm, learning on the job, and may not be getting certification.
Okay, and then let's do a roundup of questions for Paul and Laura. I'll give you a few and then you can kind of answer which ones you like. First question, why no impact, do you think, on business skills? Do you expect all labor market impacts to come from the cohort who enrolled in college, and what could you say about those who did not? Did you use administrative data as well as self-reported data? And were the educate components available to all students in the year within a school? And were there any differences that were important between the educate schools and not? I'm not sure if this, like, it was randomized, so I'm not sure if this meant kind of out of sample compared to the sample that you had, or if there was some lack of balance in the sample, but you can answer as you like.
So Paul told me you go. So as Paul mentioned, I'm going to start from the last one. So the study design is a randomized at the school level, and within school there are a selection of students that can express interest and this was before the randomization. We select students that express interest in some of these entrepreneurship skill program, but was offered to all those expressed interested in S5 and then eventually they graduate to S6 within the school that was assigned to treatment. The one in the control did not receive anything. So as Paul mentioned earlier, the randomization was correctly implemented, and actually, we can show balance table to actually show that it did work properly. In terms of hard skills, so Paul mentioned this also at the beginning, the split between soft skill, if you want to training, and hard skill training is roughly 80% was dedicated to the concept of social leadership or soft skill, 20% to the hard skill. So the notion is, like, by design, we weren't expecting dramatic impact in terms of our skill, because the curriculum was focusing mainly on soft skills. So if you want to, from a curriculum design point of view, it indicates that, just the 20%, unless you structure that 20% extremely effectively, may not have been enough, especially 4 years after the program, where maybe those are some of the skills that kind of sticks as you practice. But then suppose I don't do business knowledge or balance sheets for 4 years, I may not remember how to do it for a year unless I practice them. So the 35% to 65%, there are the split between those that are still in school, those that are not in school. The reason why, and I'm going to try to answer this question without being too nerdy, but we cannot condition on outcome. So we cannot just look at a subset of the population that by design did not go to school. And we know that at that point, our balance between treatment and control is no longer preserved, because the program showed that the probability of going to completely secondary education and then going to tertiary education has increased. And so by design, our 2/3 of the sample that did not go to school is a selected sample. So if we were conditioning the analysis and look at outcome of interest along the business dimension for that 2/3, those estimates would no longer be correct. And so we're actually extremely misleading. So that's why it's important to wait until everybody has gone through schooling and is active in the labor market.
Let me jump in here on this last question. So the current results, which find no impact on labor market function, labor market activities, are a combination of the treatment effects for kids who did not go on to college and the kids who did go on to college. So as Laura suggested, you can't look at those separately. But why are we finding a null effect right now? Suppose that the kids who acquired skills but did not go into college had positive labor market outcomes from the skills, but the kids who went on to college have lower labor market outcomes, worse labor market outcomes than they would have had they gone directly to the labor market. So so the lower effects of kids who went on to college who otherwise wouldn't have counterbalanced the positive effects of the high schools. And so just finding a zero result right now doesn't mean there weren't positive labor market effects for the high school students. It just happens to be the combination of the dynamics of where they are in the life cycle, which tends to zero out. In fact, we would expect with such a large college enrollment, probably negative labor market outcomes right now. The fact that they were positive suggests there's something going on with the high school students as well. And we'll learn all of this next year when we go back for the bicentennial outcome.
Great, thanks. Question for Emily. You had a challenging context with the addition of the grades 11 and 12 during the period of your study. Wondering whether you think that going back later on and looking for impacts would make sense, or if you think that really that was a kind of a focused time where you would see the impacts on educational attainment kind of more closely tied with the intervention.
So that's a great question. We had discussed this a lot within the research team, and essentially from the education perspective, we were a bit skeptical that we would see additional impacts with a longer run follow-up, mainly because if we weren't seeing any dropout right now, right? What would it mean if we saw sort of increased retention, say in the next year or a following year? It would have to mean that the resources and connection that they had persisted that long, and certainly in terms of a financial standpoint, the money shouldn't be that substantial. So it would have to be through another mechanism like motivation or something like that, and we just didn't see any action on those. Our thought was that from a more employment perspective, that's where maybe there are longer term effects that we're not seeing, right? If we think that this initial exposure to the labor market might help them after they finish school and then enter full-time into the labor market, that is where we might be able to see bigger differences.
Okay, thanks. It is right at time. And so I want to thank everybody so much for your presentations and contributions today, and for so many people joining us today, and for the many great questions that you submitted. We didn't nearly have enough time to get to all of them, but we will share those with the panelists, and if there's a chance to kind of follow up on that, then look out for that. So thanks very much, and we'll wrap it here. Bye, everybody.